If you're confused about carbohydrates, trust me, you're not alone. Are they good? Are they bad? Or are they actually neither? As a registered clinical nutritionist whose primary interest is in the metabolic health space and weight management space, I can tell you that the answer is neither. They are not good, they are not bad, they are simply a fuel source. And the confusion on this topic is there because the answer is actually about the individual variables that are unique to you. Are they a good fuel source for you, or are they perhaps not the best option for you? I'm going to talk to you today about three of the big, really common variables that I see that help us to understand whether carbohydrates are a great fuel source for you, or whether there's something that may be better moderated, kept a little bit lower, or really intentionally targeted through various means. I'm going to go through these three things, which is insulin sensitivity, physical activity, and then body composition. But before I get into them, I just want to tell you a quick couple of client stories that really help us to understand the nuance and kind of the spectrum of carbohydrate needs and intake. So we had a client come to us. He was a moderately active male. He was active in his day-to-day life, but he was not active in his work life. He sat at a desk, for the bulk of his working days, and he wasn't obese, but he did have a bit of weight to lose. So he wanted to kind of lose that fat layer, so improve his body composition. We did all of the basic stuff with him. We looked at his protein intake, we looked at his training, his resistance training, optimizing that. We optimized his nutrition quality, looking at vegetables and fiber and all of those great things. And he was actually doing pretty well and he was feeling pretty good. But what wasn't changing a whole lot was his body composition. So the fat loss that he was wanting wasn't happening as fast as we thought it might. So we dug a little bit deeper with this guy and we did some blood tests and we found some interesting results. So his HbA1c, which is his long-term blood sugar control marker, was up over 40, which is quite high. And his insulin, his fasting insulin, was also really high. So this man was actually insulin resistant. We didn't realize it. On the surface, he didn't look like someone who would necessarily be insulin resistant, but it was absolutely showing up in his bloods. And when we got a continuous glucose monitor on him, we just saw that his blood sugars were sitting really high throughout the day with foods that normally would have been okay for someone else. And so we're seeing this constant tweak to insulin. And when insulin's high, we're really not burning glucose well. We're kind of in this fat storage mode where glucose is being converted to triglycerides in the liver. And that was part of what was going on for this guy. When we understood this, we were able to then really personalize and tweak his carbohydrate dosing, so total amount across the day, when it was spread in his day, what foods it was coming from. And over the last 3 months, we've seen a massive shift. His weight has just changed and he's now lost a lot of that fat mass percentage that he had. He's looking really lean. He's feeling really good. But the big teller is he's no longer sleepy in the afternoons. And that feeling sleepy after meals, particularly a meal with his carbohydrates, that's a big red flag that you might not be utilizing that fast fuel source very effectively, and you might be better prioritizing fat sources for fuel rather than carbohydrates. So that was one story, one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum that I see a lot is actually more of a trend rather than a single client story, because I can think of a bunch of people in this category, and this is, perhaps we could describe them as health conscious active females. And they may be into something like mountain biking or moderate to long distance running or cycling of some sort, some sort of kind of cardio type activity, and they are health conscious. So they're not overweight. And these women often have been told that carbohydrates make you fat, right? Which is, that's very prevalent out there. We hear this all the time. And so they're running on this very low carbohydrate amount, and it's really impacting their performance. It's really impacting their stress levels and their recovery, and it's really impacting their sleep. And when we look at carbohydrate dosing for these women, and we really look at quality of carbohydrates, so what are you sourcing your carbohydrates from, refined foods or whole foods? And then we look at timing of carbohydrates around performance, around activity, around sleep time, etc. We get this real change in output, this real change in performance, this real change in recovery and improved sleep, and people just feel a whole lot better. So there's two ends of the spectrum here of where carbohydrates maybe need to be increased for some people and timed and managed more appropriately. And for others, we really need to decrease them for a time in order to allow them to be resensitized to insulin and able to use that fast fuel source really, really well. So let's dive into these three variables. The first one is insulin sensitivity. Insulin is the hormone that allows you to take glucose from your blood into your cells, burn it as a fuel. Insulin also allows you to take glucose from your blood and convert it into fat for storage. So we can think of insulin as like it's the hormone that allows you to utilize the glucose coming from carbohydrates. If you are resistant to insulin, what happens is you don't burn it very well as a fuel source. It can't get into the cells to be burned. And because our body doesn't want just loose glucose hanging around in our blood because it makes your blood sticky and it's not good for your veins and all that, it gets taken to the liver and it gets converted into a triglyceride. Triglycerides can then be stored in tissue as fat mass or burned as a fuel source. So glucose is, when I say it's a fast fuel, it comes into your bloodstream and it has to be cleared quickly. So it either gets burned or it gets stored in a short amount of time. If you're not able to uptake it and burn it as a fuel, it will go down that fat storage pathway. So your insulin sensitivity is a big variable that we need to understand when we're talking about whether carbohydrates are a good fuel source for you or not. And we can understand that by looking at your blood sugar markers like HbA1c, fasting glucose, fasting insulin, fasting lipid panel. Continuous glucose monitor can also be a useful tool here. But if you are more insulin resistant, then we really want to be looking towards lowering the carbohydrate amount and focusing on really optimizing burning fat, oxidizing fat as a fuel source. The next one is around physical activity. And this comes back to the fact that glucose is a fuel that needs to be used quickly because we can't just have it hanging around free form in our blood. So if you are sitting and you've just eaten a big meal of carbohydrates, that glucose gets into your blood, but you're not doing anything that's requiring a whole lot of energy right now. So it's not being used particularly quickly or particularly effectively. There's not a need there for it. And so it also is more likely to go and be converted into triglycerides to be stored rather than burnt. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that it's stored as fat mass, but it's stored as triglycerides, which can then be used. The problem with this is, when we're sitting and not particularly active, what do we tend to do? We tend to continue snacking or eating or whatever through the day because we still want the energy, but we don't necessarily burn it very well. And so because we're continually putting more energy in, the stored triglycerides are not getting used, so they may end up getting stored as body fat percentage. So physical activity is another big determinant of whether you need carbohydrates or not. If you are lean and active and throughout your day, carbohydrates from quality food sources like, kurma, potato, rice, those sorts of things can be a perfectly reasonable fuel. However, if you're sitting a lot, you might be better focusing on the fats and proteins and fibers, which give you that nice stable energy and keep you mentally clear and whatnot throughout the day, keeping insulin lower as well. The third one is around body composition. Now, if you have a higher fat mass percentage, you have a higher amount of stored energy on your body. So there's that. We don't necessarily want to be increasing that. And the other end of the spectrum is if you have a higher percentage of muscle mass, you will also be more sensitive to insulin and able to use more glucose. So we can kind of describe muscle as the best glucose sink that we have. It's very insulin sensitive. It picks glucose up out of our blood really quickly and uses it as a fuel really efficiently. And so if you have more muscle mass, your ability to utilize carbohydrates is much higher than if you have lower muscle mass and a higher fat mass percentage. So body composition is also a big determinant of whether carbohydrates are an appropriate fuel source for you or not. And I think if we kind of think about those three things, they do link together somewhat, because if you're more active, you're more likely to have a higher muscle mass. You're also more likely to be more insulin sensitive. If you're less active and have lower muscle mass, you're also more likely to be less insulin sensitive, which means that, carbohydrates, they're still a fuel source, but they're not necessarily the best fuel source for you personally at that time. So I want to know below in the comments, what was your biggest takeaway from this? Because there is a lot of confusion in the space. A lot of people have a lot of opinions. And the reality is it actually is determined a lot more by your personal makeup, your activity, your lifestyle than what we all want to admit. So what's your takeaway? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're interested in optimizing your metabolic health, your blood sugars, your weight loss, your body composition, then I've got a tool that might be really helpful for you. It is actually the menu plan that we use for clients in the Body Reset program, and it has our unique tailored approach to carbohydrate intake. It's on the lower to moderate side, and it's tailored across the day to really optimize sleep and really optimize mental clarity, energy stability throughout the day. So it's a really nice starting point. It takes the thinking out of it for you, and it allows you to just create a baseline which you can then build from. You can understand, how does this impact my energy? How do I feel? What's my mental clarity like on this? Would I be better with a bit more carbohydrates? Would I be better with a little bit lower, etc.? So it's all done for you. If you would like access to that, it's going to be linked in the description box below, and it's just a really great place to start. So hopefully that was helpful. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.